All right, so now let's talk about the first post-conventional stage, which is the pluralist, about 11% of the US adult population. So at this stage, there's a realization that things are not what they seemed to be at earlier stages, because the interpretation of reality always depends on the position of the observer. So this is basically relativity. By the way, if you want to go really deep on relativity, check out my episode called Understanding Relativism Part 1, and I still need to release a Part 2, but we go deep there. Relativity is hugely important, perhaps one of the most important things I talk about, and also one of the most misunderstood things that I talk about is relativity. So the pluralist realizes that there are multiple perspectives, and exploring these perspectives now becomes fascinating. Whereas in the previous stages, one entrenched oneself into one perspective, like you just become a Christian and you want to be more and more of a Christian, to hell with all other perspectives because they're evil and wrong. Here now the pluralist realizes, wait a minute, there's all these different perspectives, all these different cultures to explore, all these different worldviews. This is very fascinating. I'm not sure anymore which is true. I can't be as absolutist and certain as I was when I was a conformist. And so now I have to go and explore. And there's so much to explore. So your mind opens up to reading new books and experiencing new cultures, trying new things and looking at the world in different ways. And that process in of itself is rewarding. It gives you sort of a thrill to do that. Your mind feels like the straitjacket has been taken off. There's a realization that observation influences what is observed, so objective judgment becomes impossible. So this is actually very much like they talk about the observation problems within quantum mechanics. And actually quantum mechanics is sort of a postmodern model and a postmodern way of looking at the world. And in fact, in a sense, we could say postmodernism was really ushered in with Einstein's general relativity and then quantum mechanics, which came shortly after it. And the two key philosophical and epistemic deep lessons of sort of the general relativity and quantum revolutions in worldview is that we moved away from the sort of strict, static Newtonian worldview where time and space and matter were seen as just these fixed, given external material things, and we could just take them for granted as true. Now, with general relativity and with quantum mechanics, Einstein and Niels Bohr and others started to question, is there even such a thing as reality? Is there such a thing as time? Is there such a thing as space? Is there such a thing as matter and energy? And does it even make sense to say that we are observing an atom or that we are measuring energy in some objective sense when we are doing science? As it turns out, no, you can't do that because there's that entanglement, that quantum entanglement problem, which basically says that when you're measuring some sort of tiny subatomic particle or a quark or whatever, the problem becomes that the very mechanism that you're using to probe the particle itself is entangled with the result that that particle gives back to you. So when you probe that particle one way, it's a particle. When you probe it another way, it's actually a wave. It's not a particle. So is there even such a thing as a particle? Well, no, because the notion of particle is already relativistic. By saying there is a particle, that already implies some way in which you're probing that thing that's there. But then the question sort of arises, well, what is the thing that's there if it's not a particle and it's not a wave? What is it there until we probe it? And to understand that, go check out my two-part series called Quantum Mechanics Debunks Materialism, where I go into a lot of depth explaining those sorts of things. So there's a realization, of course, now with this relativity that judgment becomes impossible, because how do you judge a thing when you're aware of the fact that every judgment you make comes from some sort of arbitrary relative position, and depending on where you're standing, you're going to be judging things in different ways because you're going to be seeing them in different ways. How do you resolve that problem? who is the ultimate arbiter, whose judgment is the best. Well, a Christian might say, well, it's God, or a Muslim might say, well, it's the Quran. You just look in the Quran, and there it is written what are the right things to do. But that's the conventional stages. At the post-conventional stages, you can no longer rely on some sort of book as an authority. And even like an expert or achiever might say, well, it's science. Science adjudicates what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false. We can make scientific judgments. But even that needs to be questioned at the post-conventional stage, because you realize that, well, what is science? How do we know that science has some sort of absolute understanding and judgment upon the universe? Isn't science just one way of looking at the world? After all, how can you say science is the best way of discovering the truth when maybe there's meditation, when maybe there's psychic abilities, when maybe there's voodoo? How can you say that voodoo is less legitimate than science? This is what the post-conventional pluralist problem is. It's an epistemic problem that you start to face. Because now there's this, before there was just like a single worldview that you were locked into. Now it almost becomes the opposite problem. Now there's this proliferation. Once you open Pandora's box of relativity, everything becomes relative. All these different views multiply, and there's this sort of a cornucopia of different perspectives. And at the pluralist stage, you're struggling to make sense of it all. Because while there are all these different perspectives and views and cultures and lifestyles and cuisines and so forth, yes, that's all interesting and good, but at the same time, life still places very concrete demands upon you for survival. So the challenge for the pluralist is that while you're exploring all these views, you also have to try to manage life. And this can be difficult because when you become so relativistic that you stop judging things, it becomes difficult for you to make decisions in your own life. It becomes difficult for you to be able to distinguish between different levels and qualities of view, because not all views are necessarily equally practical. So one way that you can sort these views is on practicality. Does it work? Is it functional? Is it going to help to create a healthier life for me? But this sort of understanding really doesn't come online yet for the pluralist. So the pluralist is going to spend a good 5 or 10 years probably struggling with this, and this can create a lot of confusion and turmoil in one's mind. The pluralist also realizes that we cannot help but filter our observations through our personal and subjective lenses. This is a very important realization for the mind. It humbles the mind. It makes the mind start to become aware of its own biases.